The world remembers the faces of victory, the generals in crisp uniforms, the speeches that echoed through radios, the flags that waved over conquered cities. But behind every victory parade, behind every medal and monument, were men whose names were never carved in stone. Men whose skin told a story that history chose to forget. This is their story. When World War II erupted in 1939, it wasn't just Europe that went to war, it was the entire world. Because for every European empire that marched to battle, there were colonies, and within those colonies, millions of Africans who had no choice but to fight. They didn't enlist for glory. They didn't fight for medals. They fought because they were told to. From Senegal to Nigeria, from Kenya to the Congo, men were rounded up, recruited, or conscripted under colonial rule to serve in armies that didn't see them as equals. Yet when the call to war came, they answered. They crossed deserts, jungles, and oceans, leaving behind families, villages, and everything familiar. And on foreign soil, they would fight a battle that wasn't theirs, but would shape their future forever. They were called the Tirailleurs Sénégalais, but they weren't all from Senegal. They came from across West Africa, Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Chad, united under the French flag, but divided by a brutal truth. They were fighting for freedom that they didn't even have at home. Stay with me as we uncover the hidden truth of the forgotten heroes of World War II. Like, comment, share, and subscribe to this channel for more untold Black history stories. When France fell to Nazi Germany in 1940, many of these African soldiers were captured and treated worse than European prisoners of war. Some were executed on the spot. Others were sent to camps where they endured starvation, beatings, and forced labor. What? Because their dark skin made them inferior in the eyes of their captors. But even in chains, they refused to surrender their humanity. Many escaped, joined the resistance, and fought in guerrilla units, striking back at the Nazis who once mocked them. And when France rose again, it was on the backs of men the world had forgotten. While the French mobilized their colonies, the British did the same. From the savannas of East Africa to the jungles of Burma, over 500,000 African soldiers fought for the British crown. They were part of the King's African Rifles, a force drawn from Kenya, Uganda, Tanganyika, now Tanzania, and Nyasaland, now Malawi. Most were farmers, hunters, or herdsmen, with no experience in modern warfare. Yet they adapted fast. They learned to fight in the thick humidity of the Burmese jungles, a hellish terrain even trained soldiers feared. Their mission: to push back the Japanese forces threatening British India. It was one of the most brutal and overlooked campaigns of the entire war. Tropical diseases, sniper fire, starvation. Every step forward was paid for in blood and sweat. But they didn't give up. Because for many, this war was no longer about Europe's survival. It was about dignity. If they could fight for freedom abroad, why shouldn't they have it at home? While the jungles burned in the east, another war was raging across North Africa's deserts. The North African campaign became one of the most decisive fronts of World War II, stretching from Egypt to Morocco. The Allies needed control of North Africa to strike into Europe, and to do that they needed manpower. African manpower, Moroccan gummiers, Algerian tirailleurs, Egyptian laborers, Sudanese scouts, Ethiopian resistance fighters. They all played their part. They endured the scorching sun, sandstorms, and minefields to push back Hitler's Afrika Korps under General Rommel, the Desert Fox. At battles like El Alamein, African soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder with British, Indian, and Australian troops. Their courage turned the tide, a victory that Winston Churchill later called the end of the beginning. But while the world celebrated, these African soldiers returned home to silence. No parades, no medals, no freedom. Just memories of a war that demanded everything, and gave them nothing in return. By 1944, the Allies were preparing to retake Europe. The French army, reassembled under General Charles de Gaulle, needed soldiers, and once again they turned to Africa. Tens of thousands of black soldiers were shipped across the Mediterranean to fight in Italy, in France, and Germany. They were among the first to land in southern France during the liberation. They marched through towns that had never seen African faces before, greeted with cheers, tears, and flowers. But soon something disturbing happened. Before the Allies could push into Paris, French commanders made a shocking decision. They replaced African troops with white soldiers, before allowing them to march into the capital. They called it Blanchiment, the whitening of the army. The men who had fought, bled, and died for France were not allowed to be part of its liberation. History would call it logistics, but truth called it racism. When the war ended in 1945, Europe celebrated. cities rebuilt, flags flew high. But for the African soldiers who helped make that victory possible, there was no celebration waiting at home. Their promised pay was delayed or stolen. Their pensions were denied. And their service? Forgotten. In 1944, months before the war ended, some of these soldiers, tired of being unpaid and mistreated, held a peaceful protest at Thiaroye, near Dakar in Senegal. The French army responded with gunfire. Dozens of unarmed veterans, men who had fought for France's freedom, were massacred by the very country they had defended. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves. Their stories are buried deeper still. But history has a way of whispering through time. And though the world forgot their names, their courage refused to stay silent. Because without them, the war might have ended differently. Without them, freedom might have come later, or not at all. These men didn't just fight for empires. They fought for something bigger, the right to be seen, remembered, and free. Stay tuned, we are to uncover the truth about how their sacrifices shaped independence movements across Africa, and how the forgotten soldiers of World War II became the fathers of freedom itself. When dawn broke over the battlefields of Europe, the world saw soldiers wearing British khaki and French blue, but few saw the men whose brown faces carried the war on their backs. These were the African soldiers, men from Senegal, Nigeria, Kenya, Sudan, Ghana, and beyond, whose courage burned brightly in a world that refused to see them. And yet, their stories were buried under the rubble of colonial pride. In 1944, when the Allies stormed Italy, among the first to charge up Monte Cassino were Senegalese tirailleurs, soldiers from West Africa who fought under the French flag. They climbed the rocky slopes through relentless enemy fire, their uniforms soaked with rain and blood, their only guide the faint flash of artillery. These men were told they were fighting for liberty. But in truth, they were fighting for recognition, for a world that might finally see them as equals. When the battle was over, Monte Cassino lay in ruins. But Europe's gates to freedom had been forced open by African hands. In August 1944, as the Free French Army marched into Paris, the world celebrated General Charles de Gaulle and his victory parade. But what the world didn't see were the African soldiers who were ordered to stay out of sight. French colonial officers had deliberately replaced the black soldiers with white troops before the Liberation March. The reason? They didn't want the world to see that Africa had saved France. Photographs of jubilant white soldiers waving flags filled newspapers, while the African fighters who had bled for Paris were kept in camps outside the city, uninvited to the victory they made possible. Their voices, however, echoed beyond those camps. "We fought your war. Will you remember our names?" After the war, the promises made to African soldiers vanished like smoke. Their pensions were reduced. Many received nothing at all. Some were left stranded in foreign lands, forgotten by the empires they had fought for. In 1944, hundreds of Senegalese veterans who returned home gathered at a French military base in Thiaroye, near Dakar, to demand their unpaid wages. But instead of gratitude, they were met with gunfire. Dozens were killed in what became known as the Thiaroye Massacre, one of the darkest and least known tragedies in colonial history. Their crime? Asking to be treated as men. Despite the injustice, the legacy of these soldiers refused to die. From their stories rose new generations of Africans who began to question colonial rule and demand independence. They had seen too much, bled too deeply, to return to silence. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Leopold Sédar Senghor of Senegal, and other African leaders drew strength from the heroism of these forgotten men. The courage of African soldiers on European soil became a spark, igniting the fires of African liberation across the continent. And though their names may not be written in Western textbooks, their footprints remain on every battlefield where freedom triumphed over tyranny. Today, Europe's cities stand tall, rebuilt from the ashes of war. But beneath those cobblestone streets lies a buried truth, that victory was not purely European. It was African blood that helped rebuild Europe. It was African hands that held the line when the world was collapsing. And it was African courage that proved freedom has no color. Yet history books still whisper their names if they speak of them at all. But you and I, we can rewrite that silence. We can tell the world the truth they buried. Because remembrance isn't just about history. It's about justice. So the next time someone speaks of World War II heroes, remember, they came not only from New York or London, but from Lagos, Dakar, Nairobi, and Accra. Men who had never seen Europe, yet gave their lives to save it. These are the forgotten heroes who changed the course of history. And now, it's our turn to change the course of memory. They may have erased their faces, but they can never erase their legacy. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Hit that like, subscribe, and share button, Because every view, every comment, and every click helps give these men the recognition they deserve. Their story isn't just black history. It's human history.